Bom dia a todos. Hoje teremos um debate do Observatório da Inovação e Competitividade, da USP, com o tema Greasing the Wheels of the Internet Economy. O debate não terá tradução simultânea, ele vai ser mesclado. O nosso principal expositor, David Dean, ele vai fazer a apresentação em inglês. E temos aqui também os debatedores, Alexandre Barbosa, do CETIC, do Centro de Estudos sobre as Tecnologias de Informação da Comunicação, e aqui à minha esquerda, o Daniel Fink, do ICANN, que é o o gerente de Relações Institucionais. Durante a apresentação de cada um, eles vão apresentar o seu pequeno currículo. O professor Mário Salerno hoje não estará presente, pediu desculpas, teve um compromisso de última hora. Meu nome é Celso Fonseca, sou coordenador executivo do Observatório da Inovação e estamos transmitindo pela internet, onde os internautas e também os presentes poderão fazer perguntas. Para quem estiver acompanhando pela internet, o e-mail para perguntas é IEA Responde. I de Instituto, E de Estudos, A de Amora Responde, tudo junto, @USP-BR. Então se alguém tiver alguma dificuldade em fazer a pergunta em inglês, pode fazer em português, que eventualmente nós consultamos aqui os colegas e fazemos a tradução. Com a palavra, David Dean, please start. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I'm very glad to be here in Sao Paulo to talk about the impact of the internet on the economy, and in particular the report that we published at BCG at the beginning of the year. Before I come to the report specifically, I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about the background of why Boston Consulting Group started getting involved in this type of research, perhaps it's useful to start with an old story, the story of how chess was invented and what happened when chess was invented. And some of you perhaps know this story, but I think it's a useful little story to describe how quickly the internet world is moving. So when chess was invented, the inventor, who was clearly a very clever guy, took it along to his emperor, and depending on the version of the story, it was either in India or in Persia. Took along to the emperor to show what a wonderful new game chess was, and the emperor was really impressed and decided that the inventor had to be rewarded, and essentially said to the inventor, "You can have anything you'd like. This is such a wonderful invention. You can have any gift that you would like." And the inventor was clearly a pretty intelligent guy, but he's had a very humble wish. He said, "I'd like to have 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard. I'd like to have 2 grains of rice for the second square on the chessboard. I'd like to have 4 grains of rice for the third, 8 for the fourth, and so on and so forth, doubling by on every square." And the emperor said, "But that's too little. I mean, this is not a reward which is really appropriate for something as important as the invention of chess." And the inventor said, "No, this is really all I want. 1 grain of rice for this first square, 2 for the second, 4 for the third, and so on and so forth." Of course, the inventor was actually perhaps not quite as humble as those numbers suggest. And if you've been doing your maths, you will realize that by the time you get to the 32nd square of the chessboard, so only halfway through, you've got a mound of rice which weighs about 100 tons, which would easily fit inside this room. So it's an unimaginable quantity of rice. But 100 tons is still quite a lot. But that's only halfway through the chessboard. And if you continue then to the end of the chessboard, you end up with a mound of rice which is about 500 billion tons apparently, which is about 3 times the mass of Mount Everest. And that's obviously a very large amount of rice, and that is very, very much bigger than the amount of rice, obviously, that would fit inside this room. So why am I telling you that story? Well, it's an analogy which obviously relates to exponential growth. And I think one of the things that we see in the world of the internet and the world of the digital economy more generally is that when things get started, it appears very slow, 1 to 2 to 4 to 8. But within a relatively short period of time, these things mount up. And I think many, many people would say, sorry. Many people would say, sorry, I'm going to not speak at all for a second. So many people would say that this progression, which becomes more and more rapid, is actually a very strong analogy for what is happening in the digital economy. I was reading something on the plane here the other day that today's high-end tablets, which many of us use, have as much computing capacity inside them as a Cray 2 computer, which probably none of you can remember, but I used a Cray 2 computer in the mid-80s to do my my research in physics before I joined Boston Consulting. So what used to be a water-cooled computer, which would fill the size of this room, and would cost millions of dollars, is now essentially the same size as a piece of paper, and a little bit thicker, obviously. So these things come very quickly. And I think what we're beginning to see in the digital economy is that that doubling every couple of years in terms of the performance of networks, the performance of technologies, is really having a profound impact on every aspect of business and society. And so I think it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago that various clients of BCG and organizations that we were in contact with were beginning to ask for help in terms of navigating through this rapid change. If you've got something which is doubling so quickly, as in the analogy of the rice, then you need some guidance as to how you should be developing policies, rolling out networks, dealing with all of the questions that come up around privacy, around cybercrime, and so on and so forth. And one of the questions that we addressed very early on was the question of how big is actually the digital economy? How do we actually measure it? And so BCG did some work in 2010, which was published, and then that carried on over the past few years, looking at essentially, to start with, how big is the digital economy? How is it growing? How is it developing? And we came up with, I think, quite a remarkable number. By 2016, which is not that far ahead in the future, we estimate that the digital economy will account for roughly $4.2 trillion of the economy in the G20 countries. So the G20, the world's richest countries, richest 20 countries, they account for about, I think, 80 or 85% of global economic output. And in those countries, we expect roughly $4.2 trillion to be accounted for by the digital economy. Just to put that in perspective, that is about 5.3% of the overall economy. So it's a substantial share of the overall economy. Now, in some countries, you will find the digital economy much bigger than that 5.3%. So if you look at South Korea, if you look at the UK, if you look at Sweden, you will find an economic contribution of the internet in 2016 of about 12% or so significantly higher. And in some countries like Turkey, for example, or Indonesia, you're looking at figures closer to somewhere between 1 to 2%, much lower numbers. If we look at Brazil, which is obviously a member of the G20, the Brazilian number for 2016 is 2.6%. Which is about, I think if I do my maths correctly, is around a $60 billion contribution to your economy here. And it's growing at about 20% a year, 15 to 20% a year. Now, 2.2% is obviously less than the average of the G20. So I guess one of the challenges that we'll probably end up discussing in the course of the morning is how Brazil, for example, could get from the 2.6% to 5.3%, which is the average of the G20. If you could just get to that average figure of 5.3%, then you'd add something like $50 billion to the Brazilian economy, which is obviously a very substantial amount. So the growth rates in many of these countries are quite high. The economic contribution is quite large, and that's, I think, one important message that I'd like to leave you with. However, when we were doing the work back in 2010, starting this work, we realized quite quickly that GDP is not a complete measure for the internet economy, because many things that we use the internet for are actually not picked up in the definition of GDP. So if, for example, Daniel and I were selling something to each other using an online platform such as eBay, that consumer-to-consumer transaction is not actually measured in the GDP calculation. But there's obviously something has taken place. Money has exchanged hands. He has received something that I've sold him. So there is something happening. There is a transaction happening which is enabled by the internet, but that is not actually in the definition of GDP. Secondly, if you do something which we like to call ROPO, research online, purchase offline, something we probably all do. In other words, looking at the internet for a pair of sneakers or a camera or a car and deciding which one you want to buy, but then actually going to the store and making that purchase using your credit card or cash or whatever. That is a purchase which is clearly influenced by the internet because you're making all of those comparisons. But the actual transaction itself is a traditional physical transaction, and that again is not something which would technically be part of the digital economy, even though the internet has played a very big role in you making that purchase. It's not an e-commerce transaction. And so we started looking at different measures for the internet economy which go beyond the $4.2 trillion that I was talking about. And to start with, if we look at ROPO, this research online, purchase offline, we measured that in a large number of countries across the world. And actually, if you add it up, it comes to something which is close to $3 trillion globally, which is 2.7%, 2.7% to 3% of GDP. So it's a number which is actually relatively similar to the 4.2 trillion that I was talking about before. But that number that I've just mentioned, the $3 trillion or so, is nowhere sort of in the sort of any official measure of the digital economy. Secondly, there is a concept which some of you may or may not be familiar with called consumer surplus, which again is not in any official statistics, but consumer surplus is a measure of the value that consumers put on a particular product or a particular set of services. So if you like, you can imagine this in the following way. You could ask somebody, would you rather give up the internet for a year or not have your annual vacation? Would you rather give up the internet for a year or not buy a newspaper for a year? Would you rather give up the internet for a year or not buy a car? So you're making economic trade-offs, and there's a whole theory behind this which we don't need to go into, but essentially that enables you to put a value on what the internet actually is for consumers. Now, when I did a test run of this at home with my teenage daughters, they said, Daddy, you don't have enough money to pay me to give up the internet for a year, which perhaps is indicative of the sort of value that particularly teenagers get from the internet. But if we did the survey, we did it across the G20, and it turns out that the value that consumers put on the internet, measured through this quantity called consumer surplus, is around $1,500 per person per year. So it's a very, very substantial amount of money. Here in Brazil, we did the research, and the number was $1,300 per year. If we look in Europe, it's about $4,000 per person per year. So it varies from country to country, but really, even at the average level of $1,500 per person per year, is an incredible amount of money. It's the equivalent of a significant pay rise for the average citizen. And it's something which policymakers are, at least in my experience, simply not aware of, that they're making choices about how consumers use the internet, but they're unaware of the value that consumers really put on it. So if you add up all of that $1,500 for all of the users across the G20, again, you come to a big number, and it's $3 trillion, which again is not far off the 4.2, but it's not part of that. Maybe there's some overlap in some of these numbers. So we're talking about trillions of dollars of impact of the internet that are not really captured anywhere in official statistics. But at the same time, policymakers are making big decisions about regulations, about how data is being used, and so on and so forth, but trying to make decisions in the absence of many of the facts, which is perhaps not the greatest way of doing policy. The third point that I'd like to make before coming to the actual slides that I have to share with you is there's often you often hear this statement that the internet is maybe great for consumers, but it destroys jobs. And it's sort of one of those blanket statements that often is made. And of course, it would be completely wrong to say that the internet does not destroy jobs. There are jobs that have suffered because of the increase in importance of the internet. But we went out to understand whether the internet was actually also helping job creation, and we interviewed around 6,000 small and medium-sized companies in particular across the G20, including in Brazil. And it turns out that those small and medium-sized companies, so companies with less than about 500 employees, are those companies that are intensively using the internet, not just having a website, but using it for e-commerce, using it for social interactions, using it for their own purchasing, using it for international export, and so on and so forth. Those companies that are using the internet extensively are growing somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times as fast as those companies that are not using the internet extensively. And if they're growing twice as fast, then they're going to be employing more people than those companies that are not using the internet. Now, the story is going to be a little bit different sector by sector, and big companies are maybe a little different as well. But there is one important sector of the economy where the internet is indeed creating jobs. And in many countries, I'm less familiar with Brazil, but in many countries, the small and medium-sized companies account for something like 50% of the overall economy. So if that is a sector which is big, encouraging it to use the internet even more is going to drive the overall digital economy quite significantly. So those are some of the positive things about the importance of the internet, the economic value. We've talked about its GDP contribution, 4.2 trillion. We've talked about some of the hidden benefits, this ROPO number of around $3 trillion, the consumer surplus, again about $3 trillion, and also the impact on small and medium-sized enterprises. But of course, as we know, the internet is not everywhere, and one of the questions that kept coming up in the course of our work was what is holding back the further development of the internet. And that's when this report came in. So this report, Greasing the Wheels of the Internet Economy, was commissioned about this time last year by ICANN to essentially look at how what is causing this, what are the sources of friction, as we ended up calling it, in the internet economy, and how they constrain economic activity. And before I come to the actual results, let me just describe how we, well actually I think I have a, let's use this one. So we had a long conversation, did a lot of analysis to try and decide what would actually be components of e-friction, internet friction. And we decided to essentially focus on these 4 elements. The most important element of the four is in the middle, and that is infrastructure. And that we essentially define as friction which reduces the opportunity to access the internet. So it could be whether the networks are actually present, whether the price is too high, whether the number of mobile phones or smartphones or PCs are too limited, essentially anything which is reducing or limiting the access to the internet. And we did quite a lot of work around this, spoke with a lot of experts, and we decided to give this the highest weight in the overall index, given that if you don't have the infrastructure, the other things are not going to happen either. So this is weighted at 50% of the overall index. But we also felt that this was not a complete measure of e-friction, and we needed to look at other factors as well, which is why we have the other 3 elements which are on the chart. So the first one that I wanted to talk about is industry friction. And this is essentially friction which is holding back companies from adopting the internet. What are the sorts of things that are covered in there? And in the report that you have, the individual elements, the individual metrics are listed and described. But under industry friction, we've got things like lack of availability of ICT skills. So if you can't employ the right people, you're not going to be able to use the digital economy to the extent that you'd like to. Whether you have the infrastructure for physical fulfillment, so if you're in e-commerce but you don't have the logistics organizations to deliver the goods that you've bought, then that's clearly going to be holding back industry as well. We've also included in here the number of days that it takes to open a business. If we believe that the internet world is very much driven by entrepreneurs, but if it takes a long time for entrepreneurs to open their business, then that is a friction essentially on the digital economy. And we also looked at the availability of capital, venture capital, for example, to fund those startups. So there's a whole set of metrics in there as well, and that's this element industry. The next one is individual friction. And this, as you probably guessed by analogy with the other 2, this is friction which is holding consumers back from online activity. And the sorts of things that go into that are, first of all, consumer skills when it comes to the ICT world. Are they familiar with how to use a website? Are they familiar with how to do payments online, and so on and so forth? But we also included things like measures of trust and engagement. Do people, when they're using internet, trust the website that they're using, or are they being held back? Are there language issues? For example, in Europe, people would like to do much more cross-border e-commerce, but we don't speak each other's languages, so there's a friction there which would be holding back e-commerce. Or are there online payment platforms available, and are they trusted? That would be another element that we put in the individual friction bucket. And then last but not least, we have the information friction bucket, and this relates to the availability of content. So this is things like the availability of content in the local language. So for Brazil, we'd be looking at the number of Wikipedia pages in Portuguese, or when we looked at the Chinese number, we'd be looking at the number of Chinese language equivalents of Wikipedia and things like that. But we also looked at things like filtering, blocking of websites. We looked at Press Freedom Index as a measure of whether consumers were being prevented from accessing various types of content as again a component of this e-friction. So in total, 55 metrics. We were able to cover 65 countries around the world where we had a sort of good quality data. Obviously, there are more than 65 countries, but for the rest, we couldn't get the right data. And when we put them all together, we ended up with this chart here, which you can't read. It looks colorful, I guess, but you can't read it. It's in the report. And this covers all of the 65 countries. The countries at the top are the ones with low friction, the ones at the bottom with the highest score or with high friction. And you're probably all looking for Brazil, which isn't highlighted here, but it's the bottom of the 4th quintile, just above China, which is the top of the 5th quintile. And other Latin American countries are pretty much in the same place. So Argentina is about the same level as Brazil. Venezuela is further down. Peru is further down. I think Colombia is a little higher up, if I remember correctly. But essentially, most of your neighbours are around the same position on this chart. If you look at the top of the list, then it's some of those economies that I mentioned earlier on, like the Nordics, like the UK, which have very strong digital economies, strong GDP contributions of the order of 8, 9, 10%, as I said before. And the different colours here represent the 4 pillars that I was talking about. So green is the infrastructure element, and so on and so forth. So what are the lessons from this? Well, if we start with the top ones at the top, then you can't be at the top of this list without being strong on all 4 elements. So those countries tend to have strong infrastructure, supportive business environments, supportive regulatory environments, consumers who are in general relatively well skilled and relatively trusting of what's going on. And relatively large amounts of information or content that's available in local languages. Press freedom is essentially not an issue, and then you're at the top of the list. If we look for a country like Brazil and look into the specific analysis, which you'll find in the report as well, then you'll see that the things that Brazil needs to do to move up this list are very much focused around, I would say, 2 things in particular. If I were to highlight 2 things, first of all, more infrastructure, better infrastructure, faster infrastructure, more extensive, obviously. There's some challenges there given the size of the country and the geography of the country, but more infrastructure would, and we'll come back to the details of that if you like later on, but more infrastructure would be very valuable. And then secondly, I think the second biggest driver is related to skills and availability of skilled workforce and skills in the consumers as well. That's an area which can clearly be supported by educational policies and so on and so forth. So those are some, in the discussion later we'll probably come back to some of the other differences, but those are two of the big differences between the top and the bottom. So this is an index. This is not saying anything about GDP. It's not saying anything about other things. But we can take this data and compare it with the data from the other work that we had done around the economic impact of the internet that I talked about at the beginning of this talk. And it turns out that more or less, and there's some question marks here a little bit, but more or less the differences between the top quintile of this chart and the bottom quintile of this chart is about 2.5% of GDP points. So if Brazil were able to move from its position today to somewhere where, let's say, Austria or Australia is sort of top of the second quintile, bottom of the first quintile, then that would be 2.5% of GDP. And also, of course, if you then take into account some of the other effects that I was talking about, then that impact would be even higher. So we'll probably come back to that. So those are some of the details. I won't spend any great deal of time on this. These are the 4 pillars, again listed for each of the countries. And I think the simple message there is that Brazil is essentially in pretty much the same place in each of the 4 pillars. It's somewhat better on information. If I remember correctly, there it's further up, but on the other 3, it's more or less in the same place. One of the other things we looked at, coming back to the SME story, was how do small and medium-sized enterprises view internet friction? And we, as part of our survey, we asked them to talk about how they see internet friction. And this looks at, this is some of the data I was referring to before. It shows that it shows 2 things for this range of countries. The yellow line shows the revenue growth over a 3-year period of the companies which are sort of medium to light users of the internet. and the green line corresponds to those small and medium-sized companies which are strong users of the internet, intensive users. And we define that in a certain way. And you can see consistently, as I said before, that those companies that are using the internet more extensively are growing more strongly, and that's true for Brazil as well. So a difference between sort of 25% or so for the strong growth and more like 18% or so for those companies that are less strong. And interestingly, too, if you then ask those companies, and this is aggregate across all of the companies that we looked at, if we look at where those high internet companies are selling to and where they are buying from for their own purchases, then, as you might expect, those companies that are more extensively using the internet, let's focus on the left-hand side of the chart, they are selling more outside their region, selling more outside their country, selling more internationally than those companies that are not using the internet. So essentially the internet, and this is something that we're all, I think, very familiar with, the internet is essentially reducing trade barriers by enabling essentially exports to happen much more easily. One anecdote there, going back to some of the early work that we did in this area, we came across a company, a small company in the UK called Wiggly Wrigglers. This is a company which sells worms, somewhat of an unusual business. They sell worms which are used for gardening, sort of to help fertilize and aerate your soil if you're a keen gardener. And you would not perhaps typically think of that as an internet business. But this company was set up, I think about 10 years ago, in a small village in the middle of rural England where there, if I remember correctly, there were 60 inhabitants in the village and 60 cows at the local farm. This company has turned into a global internet business. They export their worms all around the world. They have been profiled in the San Francisco Chronicle, for example, as one of the best sources of worms globally. And this is a startup. I mean, they have a few £1 million of sales, but it's essentially a global business. And you can find dozens and dozens of examples like that around the world, from essentially everywhere, where a startup has essentially has been able to create an international, maybe even a global presence by using the internet to support their sales machine. So that's small and medium-sized enterprises. When you ask small and medium-sized enterprises what is holding them back when it comes to using the internet, then you get these results, and this is again across all of the countries that we looked at. And we split this out by the 4 pillars that I was talking about before. And if we focus in particular on the red bars, the ones that are particularly high when it comes to sources of friction, we talk about the process to start a new business, which is seen by sort of close to half of the small and medium-sized enterprises as a problem. If it takes a long time to open a new business, then that's an issue. And secondly, also whether the regulations are supportive for online businesses is seen as a big problem. And then looking further down the list, consumer attitudes to the use of personal data, to online payments, whether there's trust in those systems, those are also seen as issues which are holding back the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises. So I think, let me conclude by saying, first of all, just thinking back to my analogy with the rice, the internet's not going to go away, and every couple of years for the foreseeable future, the internet's importance is going to be increasingly important and really growing very, very dramatically. And consequently, it's really key, I think, for policymakers, for governments to pay a lot of attention to how they can encourage the internet's further growth. Because if they don't, then there's a risk that the digital divide, a term which is often used, of course, that will become even stronger. Specifically, the sorts of recommendations that that we're looking at relate to infrastructure rollout, to encouraging entrepreneurialism, having the right skills in the economy. But I'm sure we'll come back to those during the course of the conversation. So let's remember, maybe as we move to the conversation, if Brazil were to get from its current level of eGDP to the average of the G20, that's, what did I say, about $50 billion of GDP in addition, which I'm sure everyone in Brazil would like to participate in. Thanks very much.
Obrigado, David Dean. Para quem está entrando agora na internet, acompanhando o debate, Greasing the Wheels of the Internet Economy, não estranhar que ele está sendo feito em inglês sem tradução. O observatório não tem essa estrutura de fazer a tradução simultânea, e nós, em geral, quando a apresentação é em inglês, nós avisamos para que os internautas tenham essa noção, mas de qualquer maneira participem, porque há outros convidados que vão falar português e as perguntas podem ser feitas em português, e nós faremos a tradução para os debatedores. Para quem entrou agora, esse debate está sendo a exposição principal. Ela se dá a partir de um estudo que foi feito por David Dean, do Boston Consulting Group. Ele vai estar disponível depois na internet para quem quiser ter um acesso mais amplo. Os presentes podem pegar um relatório que está sendo distribuído gratuitamente. E agora nós temos mais outros dois debatedores. Vamos começar pelo Alexandre Barbosa, que é o gerente do CETIC, do Centro de Estudos sobre as Tecnologias da Informação e da Comunicação, e na sequência teremos o Daniel Fink, que é o gerente da ICANN no Brasil. Alexandre.
Thank you, Professor Celso. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and congratulations on this very interesting presentation. And I also would like to thank Daniel Fink for inviting me to be here today. And as Professor Celso has mentioned, I'm the head of the Regional Center for Studies on the Development of the Information Society, which is in fact a UNESCO Center for Latin America and the Lusophone countries of Africa. I'm talking about 5 countries that has Portuguese as official language in Africa. And we are linked to the Brazilian Network Information Center, NIC.br, which is the Brazilian domain register authority, and is the executive branch of the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, CGI.br. And I will maybe use my position as a methodological expert in measuring the Internet economy and the Internet indicators. And I would like to mention that when you talked about the consumer surplus and economic trade-offs, we have been conducting a Kids Online survey in Brazil based on the European model led by Professor Sonia Livingston in the LSE, London School of Economics. This survey was conducted in 27 countries in Europe, and back in 2011 we made a cooperation agreement to bring the methodology to Brazil. So we started measuring how kids and teenagers use the internet. And in a qualitative survey, we had very interesting statements from the kids. And one kid said, "The internet is my life." So this kid wouldn't change internet for anything. It's priceless. So this is very interesting how youth is using the internet and they are connected. In CETIC, we have now 9 nationwide surveys. We started in 2005 in a partnership with IBGE, which is the National Statistics Office in Brazil, measuring the ICT in households. For the Brazilians, you may know PNAD. So in 2005, we published a report, a joint report on ICT household survey, And since 2005, CGI.br decided to conduct a standalone ICT survey, a household survey, every year. So we have this type of report. This is a ICT household and ICT enterprise survey. We have, so Brazil is one of top-rated, top-listed countries in terms of measuring ICT statistics, because besides having an annual nationwide survey covering rural areas as well, we also started back in 2009 measuring ICT access and use in different segments of the Brazilian society, such as ICT in education, ICT in health, electronic government, both from the supply side and demand side indicators, in different areas. So for us, having those type of index, it is really very interesting. And I was trying to remember the other initiatives like those, like this e-friction index, and I remembered at least three initiatives that we mentioned before this conversation. The network readiness index, which was created back in 2004 for from the WEF, the World Economic Forum. Then we had another initiative from UNDP, United Nations Development Division, that created the Technology Achievement Index. And then ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, in 2005, they established the Digital Access Index. So they are similar type of index, but not as rich as the e-friction, because in my opinion, the e-friction index captures, try to measure dimensions not covered by those index. So, and I also would like to say that from a measurement perspective, it's not easy to have a single index for every country, because they are not able to capture every single subtleties from every country. But I understand that the outcomes of this framework is quite consistent. Although, if you look all the different metrics, you said 55 metrics, right? In 4 different dimensions, we will find maybe some missing parts or some gaps. But I mean, every single index will not fit or will not represent 100% of the reality. But if you are willing to compare countries and to see how the internet environment makes the enterprises more free, more easy to move, this is very important. So this is my very initial remarks, and I also would like to comment some views that it came to my mind when I was reading the report. And by the way, I was very surprised. In July, I went to a summer school in Barcelona, in Spain, promoted by the ICANN, which is the UN agency for Latin America and the Caribbean countries, and also the eBay, which is a very interesting institute in Barcelona, with a pool of universities, maybe similar to your institute here at USP. So they had this summer school on technology and policy innovation. And I met Mr. Andrea from ICANN from Brussels that presented this report. And I was very happy to see this initiative, joint initiative, because it's a commissioned report from ICANN, conducted by the BCG, which is a worldwide renowned consulting firm. And I look at that and I said, well, countries and government needs to understand how to use this framework, because many countries, especially in the developing economies, we need to make policymakers understand how to use those index and survey data, statistics for the policy-making process. And I believe that maybe European countries are more advanced in this type of evidence-based policy-making. So when I first saw this report, I said, well, this is very important. And I came back to Brazil, and then I met Daniel, and we talked about this report, and I was thinking how we could be more proactively disseminating this type of framework. And also, this is a question I have for you later on about keeping this measurement for the coming years. Is this, are you willing to build a time series of this data so that we could understand how fast, for instance, Brazil is moving to reduce those frictions or barriers? Well, in terms of the dimensions, I understand that comparing with the existing other index, you bring more solid dimensions in terms of using the internet. And if Brazil were, if South and Southeast regions in Brazil were a country, we would be similar to, let's say, Portugal or Italy in terms of broadband access, for instance. If you take out north and northeast of Brazil, we are much better. But the average for the country, so broadband penetration is still a huge barrier for us, Brazilians. We have, as a national index, only 43% of households connected to broadband, if you take the average, including rural area, which is a huge problem in Brazil. Only 15% of households in Brazil, in the rural area, are connected to the internet. And it's not a matter of high costs, it's a matter of availability of the network. Even if the householder can buy the access, they don't have the access because there is no coverage. If you take the urban areas, this proportion goes up to 48%. The average is 43%. But if you take, let's say, São Paulo metropolitan region, we are exactly in the same level of penetration as Portugal and Italy. It's not like Germany or the Nordic countries, but we have in Brazil some islands of high-tech and highly connected households. But I was thinking that you mentioned two dimensions, infrastructure and ICT skills. And also in our surveys, especially household surveys and ICT in education survey, we clearly identify the lack of skilled workers in Brazil. If you're looking, for instance, for a Java developer or programmer, you will not find it easily. And in the ICT household, enterprise survey, we have an indicator that measures the demand for ICT skilled workers. If the companies in Brazil, small, medium, and large enterprise, are trying to hire ICT workers, and if they find it easily, and the reply is not very good. Many large companies, they don't find skilled workers in Brazil. So this is a problem. And from the ICT in Education survey, we also realize that although the vast majority of public schools in Brazil, elementary and secondary level schools, have computer labs and are connected with broadband, teachers, they don't use it because they don't know how to use ICT as a pedagogical tool. And the main problem with teachers in Brazil, teachers training, is that if you take teachers from public schools in Brazil, only 44% of the teachers had some ICT disciplines in their curricula. So how come they will teach kids in schools how to use or how to program, or, you know? This is a huge problem in the country. So in the Brazilian schools, both public and private teachers are not using ICT as a pedagogical tool. They don't know what to do. So if you try to assess the public policies that foster ICT adoption in Brazilian schools, you will realize that in terms of infrastructure, we may say that we had a successful policies in Brazil, since they were able to bring ICT infrastructure to schools, but in terms of teachers training, it's a disaster. They don't know what to do with that. So the computer labs will be closed because they don't know how to use it. So those are two problems. And just to finalize my initial remarks, and then this comes some questions for you, David. I realize that you are not directly capturing the dimensions of government and regulations and policies. So I didn't see any metrics that will give us the dimension of this policy framework. And how important is it in terms of your framework? And also, I didn't see any mention to, for instance, big data or Internet of Things. So are those new phenomena important to your framework? How does it impact? Or how should we consider in the coming version of this work? Should it be considered or not? And then another question. I saw that you are using different sources as a source of measurement, which is you are using, in my view, very reliable sources. But some of them are administrative sources, like, for instance, consumer broadband penetration or business fixed broadband penetration. Although you are mentioning, for instance, pyramid research, I know that pyramid research will consult government or regulators to provide administrative data. In your opinion, administrative data versus survey data, would it change some positions for some countries? So those are my initial remarks. I'm very happy to be here with you discussing this report, which is a very important contribution, not only for ICANN, but for governments and for society. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Alexandre Barbosa. Antes de nós partirmos para as perguntas, nós temos mais um debatedor. As pessoas que estão nos assistindo, ou acompanhando o debate pela internet, podem fazer perguntas para o e-mail iearesponde@usp.br. Nós temos uma quantidade considerável de pessoas acompanhando o debate. Podem fazer perguntas. Se tiver alguma dificuldade de fazê-las em inglês, pode fazer em português e nós apresentamos aos debatedores. Vamos ouvir agora Daniel Fink. Daniel Fink é da ICANN, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. E, na sequência, nós abriremos para as perguntas, fora as que já foram levantadas aqui pelo debatedor Alexandre Barbosa. Vamos abrir aos participantes que estão aqui presentes e aos internautas que acompanham o debate. Daniel.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Professor Celso, for welcoming us here today. It's a great honor to receive David Dean here in Brazil. Thank you for coming and bringing your contributions to these important discussions.
Thank you for having me.
Alexandre, you are like the one very important reference for Brazil for collecting the statistics and enriching these discussions and strategies that we must prepare here in Brazil. And I know that CETIC is a reference for many countries thanks to your work with UNESCO, and that makes us very proud of what we are like irradiating from here. Yeah. So thank you for this, for the audience too, for being here. I am Daniel. I work for ICANN in Brazil. Here I am the manager for stakeholder engagement for the country. Right. I belong to a team inside ICANN called Global Stakeholder Engagement Team. Right. And so you heard many times the word stakeholder, right? So that's one of the words, interesting words that ICANN uses to define its job. And stakeholder, in fact, means anybody who have, let's say, a stake in the internet, and that possibly means everybody, right? Because internet, like David said, like it's growing exponentially and is affecting all of us. So everybody who have a stake in the internet is an important stakeholder for ICANN. And that's what we try to work within the organization. ICANN is in charge of very specific and technical functions in the internet. Like ICANN is responsible for the management of the domain name systems. So every time that you type some address in the internet, there must be some infrastructure that will connect you to the right place where you want to go. And this is the domain name systems. And besides that, ICANN also coordinates the distribution of the addresses, IP addresses, numbers that the machines needs to use to communicate with each other. So the DNS system is like the telephone list where people can type a name and the system translates into a number. So this very specific thing is done by ICANN. That's what we do. And we do that following the recommendations from the internet community, from our stakeholders, right? And this is discussed and developed through some policy process that we do like every 3 months, meeting people in some places in the world, and all the key stakeholders go there to discuss. And this meeting is happening now, the edition in Los Angeles. So right now they are sitting there, so many Brazilians from the CGI, the board of CGI, everybody's in Los Angeles discussing this right now. And this is very important for us to have this participation from Brazil. So the internet is a very wide applications everywhere. So we have networks that compose the internet. Actually, the internet is a network of the networks, right? So I heard some days ago that about 70,000 networks connected to compose what we know as internet, right? And in the top of that, we have so many applications, right? Email that you use, the browsers, the World Wide Web, also the smartphones, millions of applications already developed. But for all these things work together, we need some common ground. So, and this common ground is what I can do, right? So this is just to explain. And it's very important to keep this common ground stable, secure, and resilient for everybody's benefit, right? For us to have a unique, open, and global internet, right? And one of the objectives of ICANN for commissioning this report was understanding, right, how important it is to have this open, global, and unique network. So this is perhaps one important argument that BCG helped us to prepare. Even some weeks ago, we had some presentation like this in Rwanda, where some people from the government and also some ISPs from the Africa region came to discuss, and one of their conclusions was, it's great. Now we have some vocabulary to express exactly what we feel before, like working with internet. So e-friction is a great point for us to engage with discussions with the governments. So we can help to prepare new policies. And that's what the report is all about. It's not about the ranking, it's not about who is better than the other, right? But it's about where should I look at to improve my condition. And just like David said, like about the chess and the rice grains, like internet is growing exponentially. And interestingly, David, many of the countries that are, let's say, in the fifth quintile, like are very large countries with huge populations, right, with huge challenges, right, including Brazil. And that's exactly where the internet is growing now. Like Fadi was saying yesterday, I heard him talking in Los Angeles, like China, he came up with a number, 6 million internet users, just internet users. This is 3 times the Brazilian population, right now. And think about where we are going, right? So we must prepare. Brazil must prepare for that. I lived in Korea for 7 years. I just came back early this year in January, but I went there in 2006. And one of the reasons for going to Korea, it's not a very common country for Brazilians to go. You know? It's really far. Now we know a lot about Korea because of Gangnam Style, because they did a really good use of internet to spread their culture. I think this is a good example, yeah. And maybe we are doing that with Porta dos Fundos and things like that. So Brazil also have some good stories with internet practices. But back in 2006, I went to Korea because they published one report, actually a policy report, policy strategy. I don't know if you remember, David. It's called IT 83839. So at that time, the government decided, okay, we want to use ICTs, information technologies, as economic engine. And we're going to reach by 2008 $20,000 per capita income, GDP per capita. And they had this target. And that time they were about $12,000. Okay, we're going to use IT to make an economic impact. And they defined some technologies like displays, like high-speed networks, LTE, 4G, as you see, fiber optics, right, mobile devices. All these technologies they had like as a homework back in 2006. And they pushed the companies, giving incentives to prepare them to learn and industrialize that technologies, right? And I went to Korea to study because I was interested in this policy. And when I got there, the university I joined was teaching about that, exactly that topics. And when I visited some company, they were showing the prototypes of exactly the same technologies. So yeah, a huge alignment for the society. And in 2008, they announced, yes, we got $20,000 per capita income. So it's a great example of one country that set the strategy, followed, and today they are collecting the benefits of being ready, because as you know, many parts of the iPhone are made by Korean companies, right? And they are also competitive. But the only thing they cannot do so far is perhaps inventing something like iPhone, because they are known as fast followers, right? They can prepare something similar very quickly, and they have components for that, but they cannot come with the big idea, right? So in 2008, when they reach the $2,000 per capita GDP, they decided to shut down the Ministry of Communications, because they thought it was no more necessary to have Ministry of Communications in the country. This was done, right? It's just like for some countries too. In Brazil, for example, we do not have a Ministry of Water, right? Because we don't have issues with that, right? Some other countries have. They need a Ministry of Water. Yeah, maybe. Perhaps São Paulo need a, exactly. It's time to change. That's right. So they shut down the Ministry of Communications. So no need, because this is a given infrastructure. And that's reflected in the report. Like we have really high speed infrastructure in Korea. What they came up with some new fancy names for ministries, like Ministry of Knowledge Economy, Ministry of ICT and Future Planning, exactly focus in the creative economy issues. So how can we have the next Mark Zuckerberg? That's their questions. How can we have the next Steve Jobs born in Korea? So that's the type of entrepreneur they want to raise, and they are focusing now on the startups, like how to use all the technology that they have to come up with the next big idea. So this is one example that I saw very closely, and I would like to bring for you, for our discussions, our thoughts, also to think about the competitiveness of Brazil, like in this scenario that the e-friction report is showing us. So I think David brought us a great direction. So I think now we have some more light on the issues that we can tackle. Yeah. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Obrigado, David Fink. Antes de nós partirmos para as perguntas, vou novamente dar o e-mail do IEA para fazer as perguntas por escrito. IEA-responde@USP-BR. Before we go for the open questions, just to grease the wheels of the internet economy a little bit, David, how do you measure the innovation, the internet innovation, how it helps on your metrics to analyze the development of economy, how countries are doing better? I haven't seen it in your, but maybe I made not a care read of your report.
I think innovation, in some sense, is perhaps an output of this index. These are many of the metrics that we put into the index are in a sense inputs. How much bandwidth there is, how fast, what does that access cost, what is the regulatory framework, and the outputs in terms of what industry does with that could potentially include innovation. I would claim that it's more a question of what happens with those in the various scenarios various situations that you have from a regulatory perspective or from an input perspective. So we didn't measure innovation directly. I guess you could put it somewhere within the skills. I don't know, but it's not quite that. But I think it's probably more. I mean, we don't measure, for example, in this e-friction index, e-commerce, because we would see that as more as an output of this rather than an input. But I'd like also to come to some of the points that Alexander made, because I think it's important to recognize that this index, this report, was always intended as a contribution to the discussion. I think is the way to describe it, or to use what Daniel was saying. It's providing vocabulary rather than necessarily providing all of the answers. And if we were to do this study again in 1 or 2 years or whatever the right time frame is, then we could certainly use exactly the same metrics as we've used here, but we'd probably also find that there are new things that are causing, because friction is something which is never going to go away. If we'd done this work, I don't know, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about the number of people using services like Twitter. which was one of the metrics, social media, but it wouldn't have been in here. And if we think 10 years ahead and were to think of doing it at that point, then I would imagine that we'd include something around the Internet of Things. We'd probably have something around big data as well. You could argue to include those things today, but really the problem with including things which are very much leading edge is, as you know, that the data is then not available for a wide range of countries, and we had to balance here essentially the number of metrics versus the number of countries that we wanted to cover. If we just wanted to focus on the OECD countries, for example, what was just 35, 36, something like that, then we could have had many more metrics. If we just focused on the G20, we could have probably had some more metrics as well. But we were very keen to have as many countries as possible, and consequently some of those leading edge things were not included. We did include, however, one measure around open data. There's one of the metrics under the information pillar is the commitment that a country has to open data. There's relatively good data around the world on that, so that was included. So the question is whether, if it is repeated, there's always going to be a question of how comparable the data will be, because, as we've just said, so a few years from now there'll be other sources of friction that you'd need to take into account as well. But there clearly is some value in doing some sort of repeat at some point. One of the other questions you addressed or asked is how to think about this in the perspective of within a country. And you're absolutely right to say that the e-friction within a metropolitan area like Sao Paulo is going to be different from in a whole country. And you said that big countries tend to be at the bottom of the list because they have big geographies to serve, and there are obviously very special issues to face there. And that's true. And it would be nice to have a version of this which does look at different regions within a country, particularly the big countries, but even some of the smaller countries. And if you take a smaller country like Spain, you could certainly make differences between Madrid and Barcelona on the one hand and rural Spain on the other. The problem with doing that is not having the data availability. If we look at these 55 metrics and we're looking at things like availability of IPv6 addresses, I don't think you'd find that sort of for rural Brazil or even for rural Spain or whatever. So that data wouldn't be available, and even more common data such as mobile phone penetration might in some countries be harder to get at that regional level. But ideally you would like to look at this at a regional level, so that you could then make policy decisions which are more related to those regions. So I think that was, if there's a way of extending this either broadly or in specific geographies, then that's probably one of the extensions that we'd want to look at.
Well, thank you for addressing those questions. I completely agree with you. I was thinking about a study being conducted by IPEA in Brazil, which is the National Institute for Applied Economic Research, linked to the federal government, to understand impacts of the broadband in the Brazilian GDP.
Yeah.
And measuring impact, you may know that it is very difficult to measure impact of something. It's not easy. And there is a general rule from studies that every 10% of broadband increase of broadband penetration, it will affect maybe 1.5 percentage point in the GDP. And I was thinking that this framework could bring light into many studies of this nature of measuring impact, due to the nature of dimensions that we are considering in your framework.
I think that's right. I think though that where some policymakers struggle is recognizing that the impact of the well, let me start again. I think some policymakers, certainly ones that I've spoken to over the past few years, I'm painting this very black and white and probably being unfair, that many policymakers sort of think of the internet as something which is it's that eBay stuff, and it's social media, and it's kids having fun, and forget, or maybe don't even realize, that the internet today is really fundamental to every economic sector that there is. So if we think about self-driving cars, if we think about the future of healthcare, if we think about the future of education, if we think about the way in which government services are delivered, if we think about the way in which you can optimize your energy network using smart data and smart grids and so on, all of those things depend on the internet. And if governments and policymakers simply regard the internet as social media and e-commerce, then they're making a very big mistake. And I think one of the policy challenges in probably virtually all countries is to have that, in a sense, joined up thinking across sectors. So I was speaking with one company recently. I was in Nigeria. I was speaking to a company who had this idea of putting Wi-Fi antenna on street lighting, with the idea of essentially killing two birds with one stone, because in a city like Lagos, and it's probably true of many cities here in Brazil as well, you would like to have more street lighting because that cuts crime and so on and so forth. And at the same time, if you integrated a base station of some kind into the street lights, then you'd be providing not only light but also Wi-Fi connectivity to the area. So it sounds like a great idea. Yeah? What this company discovered, however, was that the department of the city government which was dealing with lighting was very different from the one that was dealing with communications. And those two departments were not talking to each other. And so this simple idea, which sounded brilliant to me, maybe I haven't thought it through to its conclusion, but this brilliant idea of using the same infrastructure, the mast with the light on top, to do two different things, essentially failed, or has failed so far, because these two departments of government were not willing to come to a common understanding if that was the way forward. So that's maybe a trivial example, but I think it's one which illustrates how different departments in government need to work to create this infrastructure, which is not only going to be relevant for e-commerce and social media, but also for essentially every industry and every sector that we're talking about.
So, David, in this direction, with this example of the Wi-Fi and the street lights, how do you face in your metrics how education, the online education, in terms of the future of this segment? You have very big companies like Pearson Education acquiring and investing a lot of money in Brazil and all around the world to have the big schools and universities. How do you link this politics and this action in your metrics?
I mean, the metric is in there essentially as, the metric that we look at is the quality of the educational system, or adult literacy rate and things like that. This is data that we didn't gather, but it's from sources such as the World Economic Forum and others. And I think in many economies, people would say that they're severely challenged when it comes to having the right skills for the digital economy. Of course, the actions that you need to take in those areas are not going to have an impact for quite a long period of time. And so in a sense, you need somewhat of a wake-up call. And in the UK, for example, that happened, I think, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when the chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt, made a speech in Britain complaining about the lack of skilled ICT skills in the British economy. Within a year, the UK government had redesigned the curriculum for schools, and now I think this year is the first year you as part of the national curriculum, kids as young as I think 6 or 7 have to start learning to code. Now that's not going to have an impact for another 10 years perhaps, but it's better starting now than in 10 years' time. I remember at the school where my kids are at in Germany, there was a discussion about whether Mandarin should be introduced as a foreign language option. And I sort of half-jokingly said, why do we need Mandarin? Why not introduce Python? This was a parents' meeting. And these parents looked at me and said, "Why do we need snakes in school?" Sort of. I mean, there was a lack of understanding of what Python actually is. And I was half joking, but part of what I was saying was really quite serious. I mean, you have to get get kids interested in this stuff from a very early age, but it has a long-term impact. What I've seen, however, is that, and it clearly depends very much on the country and on the type of school you're talking about, that there is a challenge, as you were saying, about teachers not being able to use these technologies in an adequate way. But in some areas, especially with younger teachers, they are actually incredibly keen to create their own content and disseminate that using online platforms. I don't know the situation here, but there are some places where schools are very restrictive. Okay, the intellectual property belongs to the school and not to the individual. But there are these eager young teachers who understand this stuff, and they would like to be creating their own content and disseminating it, as I was saying. So one of the things perhaps for you to look at in Brazil is whether there are hurdles to prevent those good teachers who get the importance of ICT and so on and so forth, to disseminate their content within the country. And of course, as you were saying, I mean, there are many countries around the world that speak Portuguese. There's an audience there which is much bigger than Brazil alone. So that's something which, on the educational side, I'd be looking for. And the urgency of that, I think, is very high, because if there are kids coming out of Brazilian schools who understand this stuff, who want to do more in it, and they don't recognize that the environment, and they have the sense that the environment is not supportive, then they will presumably go elsewhere to learn more about this stuff. They'll become entrepreneurs in the US or wherever, and that will be a loss to the Brazilian economy.
Thank you, David. Vamos abrir perguntas para as pessoas. Por favor, só se identifiquem e falem ao microfone, porque nós estamos gravando e transmitindo ao vivo.
Bem, bom dia a todos. Meu nome é Walter Capanema, sou do Rio de Janeiro, sou professor da Escola da Magistratura. Lá nós temos um curso de Direito Eletrônico, principalmente voltado aos juízes, para ensinar essa realidade. E a minha primeira pergunta, vou fazer uma pergunta só, seria a seguinte: o reporte é fantástico, maravilhoso, é completo, e ele mostra que alguns fatores de atrito do e-friction são internos ou locais. E com essas revelações que o Edward Snowden trouxe de que o governo americano, principalmente a NSA, tem um aparato de espionagem, e esse aparato de espionagem não é apenas de terrorismo, mas também voltado para a área econômica, esse aparato de espionagem não seria um fator de atrito externo? E como enfrentá-lo? Desculpe a polêmica.
So the question was whether mass surveillance is a friction. Sorry, mass surveillance is a friction. It's a very big question. I think, I mean, clearly the revelations of the past couple of years have shown that there's much more data out there being used than perhaps many consumers thought. And that's led to all sorts of concerns in all parts of the world about what's happening with data and so on and so forth. I think if those revelations hadn't been made, when was it, last year, then they would have been made at some point in the future. That it was going to happen at some point. And I think it's sort of indicative of I think it's what has happened essentially is that consumers have been suddenly confronted with something which they really didn't understand. Let's leave the mass surveillance by governments a little bit on one side for a second. Anyone who works in this sector will know that there are many companies who are using data for commercial purposes. It's the way that Google works, it's the way that Facebook works, it's the way that Amazon works, it's the way that essentially all those companies work. And I think the shock for many consumers in many parts of the world was that they didn't realize that if they were paying nothing for something, as has been said before, if you're paying nothing for something, then you're the product. And I think that transparency is now becoming more and more clear, and clearly the role of government is being questioned there as well. I think there's a big need for all of the players in that space to help educate consumers and businesses that data is in a sense the new oil. It's the source of growth. It's the source of job creation. And if we do things to entirely prevent the use of data in business cases, then that's going to have a negative economic effect. But clearly, I'm not saying that we need to be laissez-faire with data. Clearly, there are privacy concerns, and we need to deal with those and respect them. But so far, I think very few companies have really taken a strong position along the lines of we will protect your data, and that is part of our value proposition. So, for example, I mean, all of us have probably had this experience. We download apps onto our smartphones. We create accounts with all sorts of websites. How many of us have tried to delete those accounts? And what actually disappears? Does it just the account, or what happens to the data? There's no transparency there. So we probably need some guidelines there about what is needed. But also, I would say, particularly in the area of personal data, we need to be a little bit careful about how we differentiate between different use cases, and that makes the whole conversation much more complex. If I think of my own personal health data, that's something that I would probably be willing to share with a medical research organization, a pharmaceutical company, because they could probably do something with my data and help somebody, maybe even help me, I don't know. Assuming it's all anonymized and so on and so forth, I don't really have a problem with that. Would I be willing to share my personal health data with my employer? Probably not. So the same data, exactly the same data, two different use cases, completely different attitude. But most data protection discussions are focused on the data per se, and not on the use case behind it. And that's I know it's complicated. I don't have an answer to how you deal with the probably hundreds of different use cases that you can think of. But somehow I think we need to get away from this idea of the data itself being the problem rather than the use case. So I don't know whether this is a good or a complete, certainly not a complete answer to your question, but I think essentially the events of the past 15 or 18 months have accelerated this discussion, and that's probably a good thing. But I think there is more need for companies in particular to make it much clearer what is actually happening with your data. And some consumers will feel uncomfortable about that. Others will realize it's actually a benefit. I mean, if I get something for free and my data is then used to improve the quality of the website or whatever, then that's probably over time a good thing. But consumers need to become more comfortable with that. Probably not a complete answer, but big topic.
Mais questões? Só se apresenta, por favor, para fazer a gravação.
Meu nome é Ricardo Zagallo Camargo, sou da ESPM, que é uma escola originalmente de propaganda e marketing, agora tem outros cursos também. Bom, primeiro agradecer as falas, né? Thank you everybody. Vocês falam português, né? Os dois? Não. O David need a translator, okay. Only a question. I will try in English if I enrolate myself. I changed to Portuguese. We're talking with my brother another day. He talks about another internet, out of HTTP, a kind of a sub-internet. So when we are talking about a unique internet controlled by enterprises or extra-country organisms. I think in films of Hollywood, this kind of extra-country organisms became bad and are conducted by bad people. And I think it isn't good to have a lot of internets, or it's good to be a unique internet.
Okay, this is an excellent question, and it's exactly one discussion that is happening now. Well, starting from the end of your question, you mentioned about lots of internets, right? So this is exactly what would cause like some huge amount of friction, perhaps, if we have several internets, let's say. And the word for that is like fragmentation. If the internet fragments and becomes something like different from what we have today, like we may face a lot of problems, and with a lot of economic impact. And one example would be like when you go to another country with your mobile phone, and when you land, you receive a lot of short messages, right? Okay, you can connect with this operator, we charge this for roaming, something like that. That would happen like if you are in the internet in Brazil trying to access another network, perhaps in Asia. Like there will be something similar happening if the internet is fragmented, right? So this is something that perhaps what we have today is a great achievement, like having the mankind connected in this way, and this is something that was never tried before. So internet is the first system that we have that is shared by all the countries, who doesn't recognize boundaries. Right? The internet doesn't understand what is a frontier, what is a like sovereign region. Internet doesn't know, and that's how we try to keep that. And the way we keep that is also a challenge. Like you mentioned about the organizations that controls. Actually, nobody actually controls the internet, and that's the thing. What we have is some ecosystem with several bodies, organizations, international organizations, and that determine patterns, determine standards, try to improve codes, and try to develop policies. And the way the policies are developed in internet is also something very special and very challenging. Right? And this is like the complicated word that we like to use is the multi-stakeholder approach, like having all the countries and not just governments taking decisions, but the users, the companies, and the civil societies, and the organizations. And this is the model that ICANN tries to operate, just to determine policies for the domain name systems. And we have some other bodies like IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. Yes, also very important to prepare the codes that will be run in all the systems. And we try to keep that stable, secure, and some sentence that they say, like, if it's not break, don't try to fix it, right? So the internet should remain like that. But ICANN also tries to push the market, bring up some innovations. So ICANN is preparing with the community in some policy development process. Like the last big thing is the new top-level domains, right? So instead of .com, .net, you can have, like, for example, in Brazil, .Itaú or .Bradesco. So people can apply, companies can apply. .Rio just launched for the city. They will have a great action during the Olympic Games that will help them a lot. And this is empowering many business and is giving us lots of ground for innovations that we are not even thinking about today, but it will come up soon. And looking at the way the internet is managed as a common resource for the mankind, it's something very challenging and very interesting. And best of all, it's open to everybody to participate. And that's what we try to make sure through the remote participations. And every person can have a seat in ICANN, for example, which is just helps with one part of the internet. So it's open, quite open to everybody. Yeah, I think that helps. Yeah.
I just would like to comment on your question, which is a very interesting question. And Daniel has mentioned about the multi-stakeholder approach, which is very important to understand how it works. If you take the Brazilian governance model, for instance, you will realize that Brazil is having this multi-stakeholder model since 1995, which, before ICANN, because ICANN is today a multi-stakeholder type of organization, and here in Brazil, we have multiple actors having voice in the governance of the internet in Brazil, and most Brazilians don't understand how it works. Who is managing the Brazilian internet? Because in fact, internet is a multiple internets, because it's a network of networks, right? But thanks to the standards that we have, we can connect and understand and exchange contents and information, and this is thanks to the protocols that we have in place. But in Brazil, we have, for instance, the government has a very important role in the definition of the strategy for the Brazilian internet. Then we have academia. We have private sectors, different areas of the private sectors, like operators, mobile operators, content provider, access providers. We have civil society organizations. So this model is very difficult to have a bad organization, as you mentioned, because it's a multi-stakeholder model where we have voices from different segments of the society. And this is very relevant in this discussion. But I just would like to mention that what the EA is providing us today is a very powerful conversation to bring people interested. We have about 100 people outside, right, listen to us. 115, that's a lot of people. And it's very funny because I've been attending conference and courses that the room is almost empty, but we have 200 people connected, listen to me, so this is very funny. But I think that the good things of this opportunity is to start to discuss, to bring to the public domain very important issues. And I think that this report, along with other existing frameworks, is very relevant to be discussed by researchers, academics, policymakers. We have to bring this into the public debate. And sometimes I go to places to present statistics, and people say, well, do you have this data in Brazil? Yes, we do. And we are making a very large effort to bring policymakers to this debate. So we conduct periodically workshops with data producers like CETIC, IBGE, IPEA, other institutes, to, let's say, to raise awareness among policymakers that they should be looking to those data to decide about strategies and policies. So thanks to you and ICANN, we have this gathering today to bring to this issue to the debate. This is very important. And bring to your question about cybersecurity, I think that the model, from my understanding, David, you have a dimension of trust related to cybersecurity and the perception, but this is again a very difficult issue to consider all the complexity of cybersecurity in one single model. But at least there is a trust dimension in the model that in a way will try to capture these cybersecurity issues. But I have another question, David. I understand you have a methodology and a methodological notes at the end of the report that explain how you define the weight, and I understand the infrastructure that should be you said it's 50%, right? And then you have equal weight for the remaining 3 dimensions. I clearly understand that. My question is, first, in the beginning, when you had all those experts giving opinion about dimensions and sub-dimensions and metrics, did you have a larger numbers of metrics, and then you conducted some correlation statistical testing or multivariate data analysis that brought you to these sub-dimensions and metrics? How was this process conducted with your experts?
I think the process was very iterative. I think I can't remember how many we originally had, and we certainly didn't start with these 4 pillars. We started with a long list of various things, and we're not talking about weighting at the beginning, how we would weight those individual metrics. As we proceeded, we saw that there was some data which was less well available. Sometimes, and this goes back to a point you made earlier on about some of the sources, sometimes you find data which is incredibly good, but it's only available in a small number of countries, or even only in one country. And you have to make a trade-off there between having sort of excellent data in one country or a small number of countries, or using perhaps a less reliable source over a wider range of countries. And you can't sort of mix and match, because probably definitions are different, approach has been different, time frame has been different, and so on and so forth. So the balance, the trade-off here was always, if possible, to take a source which was obviously as reliable as possible, but as available in as many countries as possible. So, I mean, if you were to look at the individual numbers, you might find, okay, even in Brazil, you'd find actually better data on one of these dimensions from a local source. Probably it's yours, I don't know, your own data. But we couldn't take that because it's not necessarily then compatible with sources elsewhere. So we started with probably around 50 indicators, and then some were added, some were taken out. I think the pillar that we struggled most with was the information pillar. And there we resorted in the end to using things like the Freedom on the Net Index, the Press Freedom Index, as a sort of a catch-all for some of those information friction dimensions. But as we said before, clearly we could add some metrics to this at some point if we wanted to. Does that address your? And then in terms of the weighting, we did do some multivariate statistical analysis, which gave us some guidance as to the weights, and it was more or less clear from that, but also from the it was clear that infrastructure was going to be the biggest component, and then essentially to make things easy from a communications perspective. We said that we would do this relatively simple weighting of 50 and then a third, 50 and then a sixth, a sixth, a sixth for the 3. So it's not quite the result of the statistical analysis, but it's close to it. And I think that relates very much back to sort of BCG's approach in such projects. It's always to come up with something which is as credible as possible. But also something which is as easy to communicate as possible. And sometimes in this area you will find incredibly detailed analyses and theories and descriptions and so on and so forth, and they're probably far better than this in many ways. But at the end of the day, it's unclear what actually needs to be done. And just as an example of that, we presented not this report, but one of our earlier reports at a meeting of the OECD, and I then was on the receiving end of a long presentation as to why our methodology was flawed. But at the end of this little speech, the professor then said, "But my methodology is just not practical, and therefore BCG's is acceptable." And so that was nice. But why he needed an hour to tell me that, I'm not sure. But So we've always had this trade-off between sort of having it credible, but at the same time in a way which is relatively simple to use and relatively simple to derive actions from.
Alguma questão mais do plenário? Final question for you, David, just to end our debate. Despite of the results of the presidential elections in Brazil in the next 15 days, we will know the results. There is an agenda, an issue. It's productivity. It's a big issue, and IPEA is just starting. IPEA is the Economic Applied Institute. It started studying how productivity in Brazil affects the whole economy, education. So it will bring a lot of discussions. But the internet is a big issue for that. All these frictions could be inserted in this discussion, because how it's not just a matter for education. You previously answered, but it's how the working force faces internet as part of the productivity. How the companies they face that? How government plans, I mean, public policies, infrastructure, etc., etc. How do you think could we cross these figures in not just in Brazilian studies, but to insert it in your friction analysis?
I think the way that I would think about that is the following. I think, I mean, it's been debated for a long time, as you know, as to the impact of ICT technologies and the internet in general on productivity. And you can look at its historical data, and it seems that either there doesn't seem to be much effect, or it's only just beginning to have an effect, the effect of ICT and internet on productivity. I think where you have a long time series of data, it seems to suggest that in the countries that adopted these technologies and the internet very early, that you're beginning to see the effect on productivity after a break of, or a series of, I mean, probably 10 or 15 years. You're beginning to see the impact of productivity through the internet, for example, in the US. So anything you do today is unlikely to have a big impact for quite a few years. But that's no reason to put it off. But I think it requires a very holistic approach to the economy. Just saying we're going to build new pipes, we're going to put out new networks, is not going to be sufficient if the people are not in the position to use those networks, or if there's not the venture funding available to create those new businesses, if there's too much regulation which prevents companies being opened, if the way in which spectrum is auctioned, for example, is such that once the spectrum has been sold, the telcos have little incentive to completely deploy their networks. So those would also be different sorts of friction, which you can address, I think, only by taking a very much a holistic approach to the economy. And if that's missing, then I think one concern would be, and this has been a big topic of debate over the past couple of years, what happens to jobs? Because I think there's a general feeling that in this world of the internet economy, there are going to be lots of jobs for sort of the top of the pyramid, in a sense, people with education, with the right skills, and so on and so forth. And there are going to be a lot of jobs, in a sense, at the bottom of the pyramid, for people in jobs that cannot be replaced by algorithms and big data and so on and so forth. But the large number of jobs in the middle, which could be things like accountancy, things like maybe even some areas of the legal profession, certainly some areas of healthcare, they could be removed through the internet. But if our attitude is let's hope that doesn't happen and let's prevent it happening, then the impact when it does happen is probably even bigger than trying to address it proactively now, by ensuring that there is some joined-up thinking across the economy on the impact of this. Just building networks, as I said before, is not going to be the answer. Okay.
Well, we would like to thank our invited speakers, David Dean, Daniel Fink e Alexandre Barbosa. Gostaria de agradecer às pessoas que acompanharam pela internet o debate. Os próximos debates do Observatório da Inovação e Competitividade serão esse ano ainda, haverá mais dois, um sobre a indústria de fármacos, os investimentos na área de inovação e o crescimento desse setor essencial para a indústria brasileira, para o mercado brasileiro, e o outro sobre Green Business Innovation, que será na sequência para acompanhar as novas metodologias do Inova Sustentabilidade, com debatedores governamentais e da indústria privada. Agradeço a todos que participaram, os presentes e os internautas, e contamos com vocês para a próxima atividade do Observatório da Inovação e Competitividade, e agradecer a equipe de suporte que sempre contribui, Rafael Borsanelli, do Instituto de Estudos Avançados, da área de comunicação, o Sérgio Bernardo, do vídeo, Cláudia Tavares, da área de comunicação, Jorge Soares, do vídeo, e a Sandra Codo, fora os colegas do Observatório, Tatiane Botan, Leonardo Lins, o outro Leonardo, Vinícius e os demais aqui presentes. Obrigado e boa tarde a todos.